going to start in verse 1, but the verses we're really going to concentrate on are verses 8 through 10 as we take up the case study of Abraham today. But beginning in verse 1, which is where we find the definition of faith. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith, Abel still speaks even though he's dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that's in keeping with faith. And now we come to the three verses that are going to be the substance of what we talk about today, the case study of Abraham. I'm just going to read verses 8, 9, and 10. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. All right, we're going to talk about Abraham today. Lots of reasons to do so. If there was ever one person who lived who was most known for faith, it's Abraham. In fact, not only in Christianity, but even in Islam and Judaism, Abraham is known as the father of faith. And so, as we're studying faith and coming to various different case studies, there's perhaps no one better than Abraham. In fact, we're not just going to spend time on Abraham today, but probably for the next 2 weeks as well, just talking about what his faith was like, all the touchstones and touch points that would inform our faith and help us through life. Just by way of background, you can read about Abraham's life in Genesis 12 through 25. And one of the things, if you take the time to read it, and I would just encourage everyone to do that exercise, if you take the time to read it, one of the things that's going to stick out to you is there are at least 4 times where God showed up. He called Abraham to greater faith. Each time God showed up, he made some promises. Those promises sent Abraham's life almost into chaos or turmoil, and they caused his faith to grow. The first time that happened, Abraham was living in a country where he was an idol worshiper. He was living far away from where he would wind up, and he was just like you and I. He lived in a world where he fit in with the pattern of everyone around, and then all of a sudden God showed up and he said, go, leave. I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your people. I want you to leave your family. Get up, go. And the King James Version of the Bible, actually, I think puts it in the most just straightforward way. It uses these terms: get out. Get thee out of thy country. Get thee out of thy people. Get thee out of thy kindred, the King James says. That's the sense of things. Abraham, you need to get out. And so Abraham, and this passage mentioned it, he didn't even know where he was going, got up and left. When God first showed up and said, go, get out, of course his question was this: where? And God's answer is, be patient, I'll show you. The next time there's a crisis of faith, God shows up. Abraham's living in this new country. He's living in a tent. He's going from place to place like a nomad. In fact, the entire time where Abraham lived in the land where God showed him, he never owned property until he finally bought a cave where he and his wife would be buried. He never really had a foothold. He never landed there. He never owned his own place. God showed up and he said, I am going to give you this land. That's in chapter 15 of Genesis. And of course, his question was, when? And God said, well, just be patient. Wait. In fact, it was like 400 years later that his descendants would finally come back into that land. Anyway, a little while after that, Abraham was old. He and his wife were past childbearing years. God shows up and he says, I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham and Sarah, they almost laughed. They said, how? That was their question. And God said, just wait, I'll show you. And it didn't happen immediately. I mean, of course, when we have questions, we want answers just like that. Abraham was not different than we are. Years went by before God finally, fulfilled his promise to give a son. Then later, when Isaac was grown, the fourth time God shows up. In chapter 22, God says, okay, Abraham, go. I want you to sacrifice your son. And of course, his question was, why? God said, just be patient. I'll show you. And he and Isaac had to walk up the mountain together, not knowing what would finally happen. There are these 4 instances. In each case, God said, I'll show you. Just wait. Trust. Have faith. Anyway, that was the background. As we start to look at this passage in Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 8, I would say when it comes to the faith of Abraham, there are 3 aspects of faith that we can learn from, that we should pay attention to. And here they are. First, Abraham heard the call. That's what it says. Look at verse 8. It says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive, he heard the call. The second thing, and today we're going to slow down and think about each one of these in turn. The second thing is this: he obeyed and went. That's what verse 8 says. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he'd later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. And then the third thing, and this is really important, he looked forward to a city with foundations. That's exactly what verse 10 says. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. We're going to take these 3 points one at a time. Like I said, we're going to slow down. I think it's important for us to really think them through. The first point is this: Abraham heard the call. So, as I mentioned, Abraham was living in a faraway country. He was living in his culture. He was living with his family. And not unlike us, he probably just fit in with his surroundings when all of a sudden God showed up and there was this voice, and the voice basically said, Abraham, get out. And I think anyone who ever comes to faith, anyone who's ever a Christian, this will also be there at some point. You will have heard the call. Now, when that call comes, it'll be something not unlike what happened to Abraham. It'll be just like this. You'll be going about your life. You'll be fitting in with your surroundings. When all of a sudden there'll be something, a voice or something from the outside, it will come into your life and it'll rock your world. It'll disturb you. And the voice basically will say this: hey, get out. Get out. You've got to get out. Listen, the whole idea of this call is simply this: this world is not our home. We have no place here. In fact, in verse 10, it says not only that Abraham obeyed and went, right? The call not only was away from something, but it was to something, to a city with foundations. And when God told him to go, to leave, to get out, it was basically God's way of saying, look, this world has no foundations that you can build your life on. You've got to go. And I think when the call comes to anyone who's a Christian, you'll hear something very similar. I'm going to try this way to kind of get at it. This world has no foundation. Let's just talk about that. This world has no physical foundation. I'm just going to try this. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. 1977. NASA launches a spacecraft called Voyager 1. Voyager 1's mission was to explore the outer edges of our solar system. On its way out, it took pictures of both Jupiter and Saturn. It is screaming at 44,000 miles per hour away from Earth toward the outer reaches of our solar system. 13 years later, in the year 1990, when Voyager was right at the edge of our solar system, NASA scientists decided to try something. They decided to turn Voyager 1 back around so that its cameras were faced back toward the Earth. And they were a little concerned with doing it because they were afraid that they'd damage the camera by pointing it back toward the sun, but they thought it might be important to try to take a picture. Here is the picture that it took. Do you see it? Earth. That's where we are, right there in that sunbeam, suspended there. This photograph is famously called the pale blue dot. If you don't see it, I'll try to help you. I'll zoom in just a little bit. There we are. Carl Sagan, who was an astronomer and philosopher and writer, he, in 1994, gave an address at Cornell. And I'd like to just read some of his words. These are his reflections of this picture. This is what he said. He said, "We succeeded in taking that picture from deep space. And if you look at it, you see a dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever lived out their lives. The aggregate of all our joys and sufferings, ideologies and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilizations, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every hopeful child, every mother and father, every inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam." Maybe as you stare at that mote of dust, just continue with some of his words. I think they're so profound. He said, "The earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors so that in glory and in triumph, they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of the dot on scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner of the dot. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds, our posturings, our self-imagined importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light." This world has no physical foundations. Some of us, we think to ourselves, hey, I'm a big deal. I own a big piece of land. I, got a big house. I've done big things. Listen, look at that point, just a small speck of dust in a sunbeam. We're not big deals. We're tiny. And if you think about this world, and you just bracket out God for a moment, our solar system's just one speck of dust in one tiny corner of the universe. We are not big deals. And here's the point I'm making. To build your life on the foundation of this world is folly, and at some point or another, God calls us, get out. This world has no physical foundation. This world has no ethical foundation. Perhaps you say to yourself, wow, that's us. Maybe the best thing to do, since that's us, is just be good, live good lives, treat each other well. Don't cheat, don't steal, don't lie, don't murder. But if for a moment and I think it's important to do this from time to time, you just have a little thought experiment. What if there is no God? Then the question is, what ethical foundation is there? Why? Why not cheat? Why not lie? Why not steal? Why not murder? After all, that's all that we see around us in nature. The strong eat the weak to live another day, to not be eaten themselves, to gain some small advantage just in the moment. If there is no God, not only is there no physical foundation, there's no ethical foundation. We're just one more tiny creature on this small speck of dust. We're talking about having a little mental exercise. I don't know if you know this, but actually there's one entire book of the Bible devoted to that kind of mental exercise. The book of Ecclesiastes, basically what the writer does, Solomon, he says this: what if there was no God? What if all there was is what we see under the sun? And then he just explores, what is life like if there is no God? He points out that there's a lot of just cruelties and anomalies to life. If that's the case, this place is the most meaningless of place. One of the things he says that's so cruel about life if there is no God is this: that we human beings have desires which are never fulfilled in this life. I'll give an example from chapter 5 of that book. He says, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too is meaningless, he says. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owner except to feast his eyes on them? This is the point Solomon's making. If you build your life in this world, if you make this world your foundation, you will find yourself wanting more and more. No matter how much you get, you'll never be satisfied in this life. There's this interesting article I came across by a columnist named Cynthia Heimel. In the early 1990s, she was a writer and columnist in New York City. Living there, she got to know a lot of people who are celebrities today, who back then were just waiters at her table, or those who hung the coats, or those who did janitorial work. She knew people like Sylvester Stallone before he became Sylvester Stallone, and Julia Roberts, and a whole host of others. Anyway, she wrote this little column. I think what she says is fascinating. She points out that these were people with a dream who thought everything would be so much better and they'd be so happy if it all came true. And then she says, I knew them before, and then I knew them after they achieved their dream. And she says, you know what? It's strange. It's in fact cruel. Their lives were worse. Listen, here's what she says. Because that giant thing they were striving for, that fame thing that was going to make everything okay, that was going to make their lives bearable, that was going to provide them with personal fulfillment and happiness had happened, nothing changed. They were still them. The disillusionment turned them howling and insufferable. Then she says this: I've come to believe that if God really wants to play a rotten practical joke on you, he'll grant you your deepest wish, then giggle merrily as you realize you want to kill yourself. I guess that's a funny way of saying it. But listen, I know you experience this. Every time you check out from the grocery store, you'll always see there's a bunch of magazines there. What's on the cover? Like a lesson to all of us. These are people who literally got everything we think we want. They have fame, they have money, they have lovers with smoking hot bods. They've got it all, and yet why are they on the covers of these magazines? Is it because they're so happy you can't believe it? What is it? Because they're miserable. Their lives are a wreck. And it's like a foreboding lesson to us. Now, we're miserable too, most of the time, but we think that's only because I don't have what they have, and that's a dream I have, and when I get it, then I know I'll be happy. But listen, in a quiet moment, when you really think about it, and if God can break in, he'd say, get out. This world's not your home. This world has nothing for you. Or, and I apologize, this is not the most upbeat beginning to a sermon, almost depressing, but we've got to talk about this because if you build your life in this world, you have to grapple with it, death. Again, the book of Ecclesiastes, which has this mental exercise, bracketing out God. What if there is no God? What would life be like? It grapples with death. Ecclesiastes 7 says this: it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for death is the destiny of every man, and the living should take heart of it. And then in chapter 9, moreover, no man knows when his hour will come. As fish are caught in the net, or birds are taken in the snare, so men are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. Listen, if you build your life in this world, if it's the foundations of your life are here, you've got to know this, that at any minute, and perhaps the most cruel thing this book at least contemplates, and it ought to disturb you, chapter 1, verse 11, no one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. Here's the point. How many of you know all the names of your great-grandparents? Just raise your hand. Okay, there's a couple. How many know the names of your great-great-grandparents? Okay, the number of hands go down. Here's the point. You may say to yourself, I'm a big deal. My life is here. I'll be remembered. Listen, you're the one who's most likely to know your family members. I don't know their names. And in 2 or 3 or 4, but certainly 5 or 6 generations, no one will even know your name. No one will remember you. It won't have mattered whether you were good or bad. It won't matter. You spend all kinds of times worrying with anxiety about all the things of your life. And here's the point. If you build your life here, it won't matter at all. This world won't have even cared that you lived. The call to Abraham is simple. Get out. This world has nothing for you. Don't just fall in and do what everyone else is doing. Listen, we've all got an imitation gene. I'm sure it's the same with you that it was with me. You're born, you see what your parents do, you fall into that. They say go to school, you go to school. They say get a job, you get a job. You wind up married, you buy a house, you have kids. You just do what everyone else does. Here's what I mean. The call of God at some point, if you're a Christian, comes in and disturbs that and says, whatever you do, don't build your life here. Get out. This world has nothing for you. That's point number 1. Points number 2 and 3 are going to come a little quicker. Point number 2, Abraham obeyed and went. That's what it says here. When Abraham was called to go to a place he'd later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and went. If you've been here the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about a definition of faith. We've discovered that there are 3 steps or components to faith. 3 Latin words, we've done our best to translate them. Here they are: notitia, information or understanding. The first step is this, and it's important to understand this. It's thinking. There's a certain content or information. If you're a Christian, you've got to think about it. This is an important point, because actually the way the world thinks about Christians, they think that Christians are those who turn their mind off. Like there's a reality out there, and to be a Christian, you turn your mind off to those things and just section reality out. Instead, what we've said is only those who have true faith are the ones who think deeply. They think about, is there a God? Who am I? Have I been cut off from God? Do I have a need for Jesus? Faith always starts with thinking and information. Then there's a second step, a census. The idea of a census is this: you get a conviction. Listen, faith is thinking, but it's not just endless thinking. We said this last week. It's not just believing in God, as though there's a God that exists out there. It's not just, believing certain doctrines. Okay, I know this is what Christians believe. It's finally saying, I agree. That's right. I'm convicted that the things that Christians are saying are true. And so it's not just thinking, it moves down into the heart where we agree. We assent to the truth of it. But now today we arrive at a third point. Faith isn't just knowing a certain amount of information. It's not saying, and I agree that that's right. It's finally and totally rearranging your life on the basis of that information that you agree with. You finally say, okay, if there is a God, and if I've been cut off from him, and if he sent Jesus in the world to save me so that I could be right with him, then the only plausible thing for me to do is obey and live my life out in total surrender. Here's what happens. It moves from your head to your heart, out into your actions, and the way that you live your life. To press down on this point, the most famous sermon that Jesus probably ever gave is the Sermon on the Mount. The conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount is the story of the wise and foolish builder, and I just want you to see what it says. Jesus said, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who put his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice." See that? You can hear, you can agree, but you finally got to put them into practice. Everyone who does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Faith finally moves from our head down to our heart into our living. And anyone with true faith, finally, like Abraham, it pours out into his life. Which leads to the third point. When Abraham was called, not only was he called to get out, to leave, to go. This world has nothing for you. Don't just fall into the pattern of the world. He was pulled forward toward something. He was looking to a city with foundations. Now listen, if you've gotten this far, if you can understand what I'm saying, you've probably arrived at the same conclusion I have. This world has nothing for me. There's no solid foundation for me to build a life on here. That could just lead to despair. There is this city whose architect and builder is God that has foundations, a place to build your life. That becomes the vision. And that's what Abraham was doing. That was the content of his faith. And here's a way of putting it. Abraham, he believed that actually there would be a city where he would dwell with God. He didn't know how. He knew that by his sin he was separated from God. But he believed God somehow will solve this problem. He looked forward to it. We actually, because we're Christians, we get to look back. We see how God solved the problem in the person of Jesus. Here's the most important thing. In order to live with God, we have to be made right with him. And the only way to be right with God is through Jesus Christ. The Bible says he entered this world. He lived the life we should have lived. On the cross, our sin was taken off of us and put on him. He was punished in our place so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be set free. And when he was raised to new life, that allowed this possibility that we could be with God and his new life could come inside of us so that right now we have eternal life. Right, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son. Whoever believes in him will not perish, but has eternal life. And listen, let's just think very carefully about these words on the screen behind me. Now, you might not know this, but in Israel, in the land of the Bible, the only place you find sand, it's a very rocky place, the only place you find sand is in the dry season. When all the riverbeds or wadis are dried up, that's where you find sand. And maybe in that dry season, you'd come along, and of course, there are hills around you. It's a very rocky place. You'd say to yourself, wow, the easiest place to build a house is right down here. I mean, I don't have to be up in the hills. I don't have to be on the rocks. This would be the easiest place to build a house. But if you build your house there, it's only because you don't have the foresight about what's going to happen. The rainy season will come again. And when the rainy season comes, the rains will fall, the streams will start to rise, and your house will float away. You didn't put it on a good foundation. And the reason Jesus ends his sermon this way is because actually it's a way of speaking about this life. Only a foolish person would build their house where there's no solid foundation. Only a foolish person would say, you know what's important? This world, the things of this world. So Jesus says, be wise. Build your house in a solid place. Don't store up for yourself treasures here. Store up for yourself treasures there. The only way to do that is to be right with God. Jesus ended his sermon this way so that we'd know the only place to build your life is not in this life, get out. It's in the next life through Jesus Christ. And I want to conclude this way. Abram heard the call of God, which is necessary for faith. That call can come any number of ways. It can come through a book, it can come through a friend, it can come through a quiet moment while looking at the stars at night. It can come in a moment like this, where all of a sudden it just dawns on you, this world isn't worth investing in. It has nothing for me. I'm not going to live my life for here, I'm going to live my life for there. And if you hear God calling you right now, if this is a moment where all of a sudden God's broken through and you feel the disturbing thing God's call does, I don't want you to ignore it. And if you're hearing it for the first time, is there any reason why right now you won't put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ and make a wholehearted life decision to build your house on something far more solid than what this world offers? If so, I just urge you to come to Jesus. And maybe you're here and you've been a Christian for some number of years, maybe for a long time, but in this moment you hear God calling. If so, I also say, don't ignore that. Listen, whatever God's saying, and this happens. There's ways in which you leave, you get out, but then all of a sudden the world starts to creep back in. Maybe you hear God in a new way saying, get out. Build your life on something more solid, and there's something particular he's saying to you. If so, I just urge you to listen to God's voice. And as we conclude today, if you're hearing God's call, and as the pastor of the church, I just want to pray for you.